Welcome, everyone. I'm Jason Franks. Today, we're going to walk through what your agency needs to know about the new changes in CJIS 6.0 and how you can understand if you're compliant or not. All right. The objectives for today is we're going to try to understand the key changes that were introduced in this version of CJIS. We're going to walk through a compliance roadmap. We're going to talk about some of the technical controls, the templates, and the other support services that are needed to be able to comply effectively. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to implement a GRC framework to maintain a sustainable compliance. First, just a little bit about CJIS 6.0. It was published last December on the 27th. It replaced 5.9.5. What this reflects, it reflects the modernization and the shift to making sure that we are more quickly and readily identifying threats and putting in the mitigation factors and all the controls to help combat those threats. With a key focus on automation, the supply chain, and the governance. And we talk about automation, it means in all types of things, right? So not usually when you think about automation, you think about, are my patches going to get applied automatically, right? That's one example of automation. Or do I automatically get alerted when there's a threat that is detected within my environment? But also about processes. Do you have processes in place where you automatically are going and you're doing your annual reviews on policies and procedures? So we'll kind of talk on that and touch on that. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and get right in it. And the first one we're going to talk about is the assessment, authorization, and monitoring family. These controls this control family, which was put in this version, focuses on establishing the foundation for accountability and continuous oversight. So CA1, this is all about policies and processes. It's making sure that somebody owns this, and it has to be reviewed at least on an annual basis. CA2, this talks about control assessments. How are your controls being implemented, right? And when you go through these control assessments, that you're using independent assessors to actually execute that. So then you've got an unbiased opinion, a fresh set of eyes. CA5, this emphasizes having a plan of action and milestones, or a POAM, right? What this talks about after you've had an assessment, you put stuff into a risk register, and then you also put stuff into a POAM, plan of action or milestones. And that's going to be something that you're going to update at least every 6 months. But if you're making this a living and breathing document, you're doing this on a continuous basis. As risks are identified, you're going to prioritize them and remediate them based upon the likelihood and the potential impact that could have on your agency. And CA9 talks about the internal system connections, right? So really what this is making sure that you have a documented set of ports, protocols, services, how things come in and out of your environment that has CJI. That's what CA9 touches on. CA7 is a big one. This dives into the deeper continuous monitoring. Before, continuous monitoring was just about, are you monitoring your logs? Now it's gotten a lot more, as you can see, account management, remote access. Are you watching for the training? How often the training is going on? You're maintaining the training records. Do you have a way that you're monitoring your configuration change controls? Any kind of change management processes that you have in place, and so on and so forth. This really is the linchpin towards continuous monitoring in your environment. Now, another new family that was introduced in 6.0 is supply chain risk management. Now, this right here is very important because, You may or may not have heard folks like myself or others talk about supply chain risk management, but it's really key. And it's something that CJIS has really tried to put an emphasis on, right? You see SR1 and SR2, those are all about policies, processes, and having yourself a management plan, right? And it also requires that you have a supply chain risk management team, right? And it should be a cross-functional kind of team, right? So it's not just going to be IT folks. It's going to be maybe somebody in HR or somebody who has operational knowledge. You just want it to be a cross-functional team that's going to be managing your supply chain risks. SR5, this talk calls for having procurement that reduce risk. Vetting vendors, having documented acquisition criteria, things along those lines. SR8 requires notification agreements. Third parties must tell you if they experience a compromise. This should be a formal clause in any contract that you have with any vendor. SR10. This introduces the physical inspection of systems and components for tampering during and post-procurement. Then SR12, this addresses component disposal. Your supply chain governance must align with your media protection policies, ensuring that secure destruction of devices or components. This will reinforce the need to treat supply chain integrity as a full life cycle, from the acquisition to the disposal of assets. System and services acquisition, right? So this control family focuses on integrating security in how systems and services are brought in and also developed, if you happen to do any in-house development. SA1 through SA4, this really speaks to having policies and allocating resources early in the process, right? Embedding security into the system development lifecycle, and then writing contract clauses that ensure vendors meet privacy and security expectations. This is critical as more systems are developed offsite or procured from third parties. Well, let me see if there's any questions at this point. Looks like that. Sorry, I was just trying to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Apologize. SA5. This is requiring thorough system documentation, from admin guides to known vulnerabilities. This is really just to make sure that you and your team understand risks that are associated with these systems. SA8 and SA9, these address engineering principles and oversight on external systems. You must document these relationships with agreements such as the CJIS security addendum and ensure that you retain the right to audit. This ties directly into third-party risk management. CJIS does expect us to have those detailed contracts and technical clarity. Excuse me. Here, CJIS places responsibility directly on developers. So if you have in-house development, or if you're outsourcing development for a system to go into, you want to make sure that you're following the secure development configuration management requirements. There's change tracking, flaw remediation, mandatory security testing. SA15, this gets into the development teams using vetted tools, following the secure coding practices, secure engineering practices, performing criticality assessments. These aren't just for internal dev teams. Like I said, these must be contractually enforced with any software system vendor. Personnel security. There's been a lot of enhancements to personnel security. Just like with every other control family, they made sure that we have policies and procedures. I always like to refer these as the -1s. So every control family always has a -1, which is always going to be tied to policies and procedures. Every single policy and procedure needs to be reviewed and updated on it at minimum on an annual basis. But 2, 3, and 4, these start to talk about getting into making sure that you have a risk. Like number 2 is making sure you've got a risk designation for every position in your agency, right? So this, what that does is if you assign a risk level to it, it will help you with PS 3 and 4, right? So you're going to enforce your screening for access. You're going to ensure timely access for termination upon separation as well. These are sometimes often overlooked, but these are human factors that remain one of the top risks to CJIS compliance. PS5 and PS6, these emphasize the reevaluation of access when someone transfers and the use of formal access agreements. PS7, this ensures external personnel are held to the same standards, they're tracked, and they're reevaluated on a regular basis. PS8 and PS9, these require documented sanctioned policies and are defined job roles that include security responsibilities. These controls emphasize that CJIS compliance must be embedded in the organizational chart, not just in your policies. So what does this mean for your agency? There's a lot of new safeguards, right? Governance is a requirement. Policies and documentation updates are expected. These are supposed to evolve from just being on paper to an operational process. Compliance isn't something you just check off once a year anymore. It demands, CJIS 6.0 demands living, breathing framework for continuous enforcement. So how do you ensure that you maintain compliance? Through by implementing a GRC framework. GRC is a acronym for governance, risk, and compliance. See, governance is establishing your policy, your processes, your policies, the different accountability structures that are going to guide your decisions. Risk management, identifying, assessing, and mitigating risks, right? And the compliance. For us, as we're talking about here, making sure that you're compliance with CJIS standards. Governance provides the structure and accountability. Risk management guides how we prioritize the efforts, and compliance ensures you're in alignment. When I think of GRC, I tend to think of it like kind of like I think of it like as the rule book, the playbook, and the scorecard all in once, right? Governance defines the rules, right, and the expectations, right? The risk management is the plan, right? Is the plan or the plays that you're going to actually play with, right? And the compliance is how you're measured. So right here, what I'm sharing with you, this here is kind of like a GRC process, almost it's a life cycle, if you will, right? You start with an assessment, right? What kind of gaps do you have? All right. Now that you've identified your gaps, now you got to plan them, right? So you put together a risk register, you put together a POAM, and you prioritize how you're going to remediate those risks. After you've done that, you've decided you've got your controls that you've selected. Now you go to the implementation phase. Now you're going to implement your controls, right? Some being technical, some may be administrative, right? Now now that you've got the controls in place, now you want to set up monitoring, right? So you want to monitor to make sure that the controls are doing what you're expecting them to do, right? And then there's the continuous improvement, right? Continuous improvement should be involved with every single aspect of your operations, right? But in this, it's whether maybe it's a post incident, right? Maybe you had an incident and you're looking for lessons learned, right? And how do you apply those lessons learned to ensure that you're going to be better at it the next time? So let's kind of talk about what this might look like in a real world process, right? And we'll do it at a kind of like a low level. So let's just talk about a server. Okay. You've had an assessment done, right? And during the assessment, it was discovered that you've got a Windows server that's running an outdated version, right? So this here is not only is it a risk, not only is it a technical risk, but it's also a compliance risk, right? So now that you've identified that, all right, now you've got a plan. How are you going to prioritize the risk, right? How are you going to handle that? What are you going to do from controls perspective, right? Are you going to upgrade the server to a server version that's not end of life, that is still supported with patching, or are you going to take it offline and you're just going to go ahead and move away from that server? No, excuse me. So now that you've planned it, you said, okay, well, we're going to just upgrade the server to a new version. All right. Now you go to implement it. So you apply that. All right. Let's go ahead and go through the Windows update the Windows upgrade process. Right. And while you're doing that, you want to monitor it. Right. You also want to make sure that you've got a plan whenever you are implementing that. If something goes wrong, what's the rollback procedures? Right. That's all part of this process. And then obviously you've got your continuous improvement. Did something go wrong during that Windows upgrade process? Did something fail, right? Maybe you found out that the hard drive didn't have enough space, what have you? So you want to make sure the next time you go through this process, you've got additional checks. So I'm going to look at these questions real quick. I see Jay said personnel security. Is that for all personnel or geared towards IT? Great question, Jay. This here is about all people in the agency, is what this, anybody, specifically anybody who potentially has access to CJI. I see Jason answered Matthew's question. PS4 with personnel termination, does that include when people leave on their own terms? Or is it any separation? Any type of separation at all, Samantha, whether they leave on their own or they're terminated. You just want to make sure that you're following those processes the same, regardless of how the separation takes place. Jay, would the NIST RMF be adequate? So the NIST, so when you say the NIST RMF, I'm guessing that you're talking about the risk management framework, which is a different type of framework. Jay, as I'm trying to understand what I don't know if you have the ability to maybe provide a little bit more to understand that question, Jay. Because I don't know if maybe you meant the CSF. So, is there any additional questions? Kind of went through this a little bit faster than I anticipated. Right, Kyle, is a different MOU or security addendum needed for an on-site contractor to access hard copy CJ docs that contain CJI, PII versus accessing same docs but digital versions? That's a great question. I think so obviously there's different things you have to think through on that, right? So um, you're you're going to have to, you're still going to follow you're going to follow the same principles, regardless if it's a hard copy versus a digital copy. But obviously, access control mechanisms are going to be a little bit different, right? So if they're making sure somebody has the digital access to those documents, are those going to be separated? It's really going to be about the access controls. Document references penalties in multiple places, however, does not provide a definition of the size and scale. Do you have any links or further information? Yeah, you're right. They have referenced other penalties. I've been trying to find more information on that. Unfortunately, I just don't have any additional information on that, but I am trying to find that out, because that's kind of like honestly, that's the $1 million question that everybody's kind of curious of. When you talk about vetting vendors, what is the standard or expectation for this? Many vendors such as Rapid SOS, Rave, Flock, Priority Dispatch are connected in the PSAPs. How do we ensure they are all compliant or verify this? Well, that's a great question, right? So there's multiple things there that you can do to try to help establish that. So if you've already got contracts established with them, it's a little hard to get stuff put in those contracts after the fact, right? But at its core, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are you're giving them what your security standards are, telling them this is what you need to follow if you want to gain access to our systems. Right? Maybe to have them give you at the least give an attestation that they are compliant with your security standards. Perhaps some people like to. I've seen some organizations, some agencies will actually want to see your most recent risk assessment, right, and show that what you're compliant with. So there's different ways to kind of tackle that. And you want to make sure, though, at the end of the day, it's trust but verify, right? So if these guys have access to, say, CJI, or the ability to access it, you want to make sure you got mechanisms in place to build that monitors what that is they do, right? You want to you want to make sure that these guys aren't having group accounts, right? And what I mean by group accounts is that there isn't a standard administrative and password that 57 people use, the same credentials. You want to be able to authenticate a user session to an individual person, to an individual identity. I'm overseas only. How do I verify they are current personnel, etc.? Um, Heather, are you? Let's see. Talk about vendors. So see what's online. Okay. Did I miss somebody's question there? I think I think they were all answered. I thank you, Lori, for providing that answer as well. I'll I'll hold on here. I do thank everybody for who attended. I'll stay on here for a couple more minutes in case there's any additional questions that want to be asked, or maybe you can get them typed in real quick. Templates for developing this policy. Lori, so there's a ton of templates. So Lori, there are a lot of different templates you can find out there. Now, I don't think you're going to find any that are specifically CJIS aligned. I know we have here at MCP. I know we do have templates that are CJIS aligned just because it's what we do. And we can always have that conversation if you're interested in that. But there are a ton of different templates, whether it's through the SANS. There are a lot of different templates out there. What are requirements for MFA? Matthew, good question. So MFA it's supposed to be for it's required for all users accessing CJI, both administrators and regular standard users. Heidi, I see you got it. Does it have to be for each application, or is the MFA into Windows by each user okay? So I think as long as before they access CJI, as long as there's multiple authentication types, I think that scratches that itch, if you will, right? So if they log in once into Windows, but then have to log in a separate time into a different application to access the CJI, everything that I've seen, that appears to satisfy that requirement. You're welcome.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, you've got an expert right here who can answer your questions.
So a login to Windows, should not be a generic login. Like that's where I was talking about with a group, like a group account. They should be individual. When it comes to accessing CJI though, right? So that's the question when it comes to CJIS specific, right? If it's CJI, if they're gaining access to CJI, a generic account will not work. It needs to be an individual account that can be 100% accurately identified and traced back to an individual. Jennifer, let's see, compliance, all this vendors. So this all, let's see, vendors radio, etc. Anyone working with your department. So this here is everything that we covered. Everything in CJIS is going to be applicable to anybody touching CJI, right? So whether it doesn't matter if it's someone within any department, any agency, any third party, all of these requirements are applicable. What requirements? What is your understanding of where password requirements currently stand? Which requirements are enforceable right now? Well, that's a great question. I will pull that up right now, just to be sure, if you don't mind. I'm looking at it. I'm going there now to look at it.
And while he's looking up that information, I just want to say again, if you've got any questions, feel free to post them so that we can get to those questions. And again, we thank you for joining us, and hopefully he'll have an answer here shortly.
Okay, so sorry, it's taking me a few minutes. I'm just looking at just to make sure I don't give you the wrong answer. I'm under identification, authentication, IA5, authenticator management, and types. And that's because there's a lot. It's kind of they've added a lot more to it where it's not just straightforward anymore, because it gets into the conversation about um, if it's a human derived password versus a machine generated password. So it looks like the minimum is still 6 characters, if I'm reading this correctly here. Or excuse me, 8 characters, excuse me. The new standard, is there any distinction between active and passive CJI? Tim, I'm not sure if I understand what you're asking. Active and passive CJI. Are you talking about like old data versus new data, kind of along those lines? What about a group account for mobile devices and police vehicles and shared Windows login, but individual CJIS application logins? So Dennis, on that, so a group account for mobile devices, so they have a shared Windows login, but then they use individual accounts when they log in, when they're accessing CJI. If I read, if it's set up like that, it's at least it's individual for the CJI, so you're okay that way. But obviously that's not a best practice, if you will, right? But from a compliance perspective, I think you're okay. Well, like I said, it's not. I would put that in the best practices category. Samantha, all contractors that come into the building, they need to complete CJIS security awareness training. I understand most vendors are in there and we can view them, but what about contractors? So, Samantha, that's a great question. There's some of that is really going to be dependent upon how you want to manage your contractors. For myself, I would have anybody who's going to potentially have access to CJI, I would have them go through that security awareness training. Interpret CJIS 6 to follow in priority changes 2 through 6 within the doc. So they have put their priorities on them. They have assigned priorities to all controls in CJIS 6. Oh, back to your CJIS 6 priority changes, 2 through. I think priority, you should probably, what you want to do is if you go through a CJIS assessment and you're trying to do a gap assessment, I would make sure that the prioritization is included in that assessment, right? Into that model. That way it helps. It just helps make sure that you prioritize risks, accordingly. All right, Tim, active is the ability to actually query a database versus having the data displayed. So we can get the data, but it might be displayed to a fire unit on the same call. But actually query database, okay, versus having data displayed. Data, but it might be displayed to the fire unit. Call. An example, our request dispatch to run an individual. Data comes back and it's put our fire personnel can see the information. Are there any different requirements of the CJIS? Tim, I have not seen anything that would say there's anything different with your example. Amy, where does the ownership stand on the creation and maintaining of these policies? For example, would a PSAP dispatching for multiple agencies be required to come up with their own policy, or would it be up to those individual agencies? That's a great question, Amy. Let me see, PSAP dispatching for multiple agencies. So there's going to be some joint collaboration there, Amy, with your example. The PSAP that does the dispatching for multiple agencies, it probably would behoove the dispatching to kind of work with all the agencies and try to hopefully you can be on the same sheet of music, right? And simplify that, but it's going to have to be a collaborative effort. That's a good call. That's a good question. Ultimately, though, it's going to come down to who's the CJI owner. Is there any additional questions? So,
Oh, Jason, did you get another question?
yeah, there's another question. I'm reading it right now. Yeah, it's the gap analysis and ability to get everything done in a timely manner based on resources is a challenge. It is. It is a real challenge. And I mean, let's face it. There's a lot of complexities, right? There's the complexity just continues to grow, right? But this the FBI's stance on this is making sure that we're looking at this in a real risk management framework type of way, right? That's really what this comes down to, because CJIS is continuously aligning itself with the NIST 800-53 moderate controls, and that's why you keep seeing more and more get introduced as it becomes more in line with that. On a new tag when trying to go over this document. Um, yeah, Samantha. So that's a great question. Recommendation or advice you can go with when trying to go over this document. Yeah, trying to tackle CJIS. I mean, it's a big elephant, right? One bite at a time, honestly. Um, and there's a lot of different control families. Try to understand each control family, right? So if it's, you know, take some time to understand what the AC family is, access control. You know, take some time and understand them each family one at a time. It would be the best recommendation. I only know this stuff just because I've been doing this stuff for so long. This compliance and before I came to MCP, I was doing this with the DoD, and 853 was the world we lived in. So I'm used to all of this. Yeah, to go back to Tom, to go back to yours before when you talked about having a PMP or a RACI or Gantt, those would help. Those definitely would help. You want to make sure that you understand the roles and responsibilities from the outside parties and the agency, just to make sure everybody's properly aligned. Yeah, good call out, Caitlin. Yeah, there's a companion document, and that's actually I find myself leveraging that a lot. It's an Excel spreadsheet. Where's that document? Here, I'll take here. I'll put that. I'll post that in the chat here where it's at. Let me go there and grab it real quick. So I'm posting in the chat. I just posted the link for where you can find the CJIS resources, right? So there's the policy. That's the Policy Resource Center, and what you're going to see is that's going to take you automatically to the policy. And then if you look above that, you'll see a few other links: home, requirements, companion document, both in PDF and Excel. I find myself utilizing the Excel one a lot, especially whenever we're doing a compliance review with agencies. Yep. Yes, he does, Talon. That's very good. Thank you. Yeah, I think the last one he did was, I think it was like 2.5, 3 hours long for the CJIS 6. I think that's about it. Um, I appreciate it, guys. I'll stay on here for another minute or two just in case you guys have any other questions. You're welcome, Matthew.
Okay. Well, Jason, thank you so much for the insights and answering all those questions, and thank you all for joining us today. And we certainly look forward to seeing you again in another Mission Critical Partners webinar. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email us on the link that was provided in the emails. Jason Franks, if you want to share your email as well as Jason Franks, I can actually do it. Jason Franks at missioncriticalpartners.com, and he can help you with any questions you may have as well. And he just shared it in the chat or in the Q&A question box. So again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you soon.